Following in the wake of the Horus Heresy, a conflict that was quite possibly the greatest civil war in all of human history, the Emperor of Mankind, having been grievously wounded in his duel against the arch-traitor Horus Lupercal, would be forever interred within an ancient piece of arcane technology known as the Golden Throne. The purpose of such an act was twofold. Not only would the Golden Throne come to serve as the Emperor's life support system, but perhaps more importantly, it allowed the Emperor to harness the throne's rampant, nigh uncontrollable energies. These energies, if left unchecked, would not only threaten to scour Terra with a torrential wave of psychic fire, but cause the Astronomicon, the psychic beacon that allows human vessels to navigate the ever-shifting tides of warp space, to eventually flicker and die. In order to keep the Golden Throne fully operational, and in turn ensure the Emperor's continued survival, the souls of thousands of psykers are sacrificed to fuel the throne on a daily basis, ensuring that its power is kept at optimum levels. However, starting sometime around M36, many of the Golden Throne's various components would begin to fail, making it more and more difficult for the tech priests of the Adeptus Mechanicus to maintain. By M41, much of the Golden Throne had degraded beyond the point of repair, with the knowledge to do so being beyond the scope of the Martian priesthood. In desperation, several of the Terran High Lords, including the likes of the Fabricator General of Mars, Speaker of the Chartered Captains and the Master of the Astronomicon, along with the Radical Lord Inquisitor Adamara Rasilo, would in secret strike a deal with the insidious and treacherous alien race known as the Drukhari, who claim to be capable of providing replacements for the damaged and non-functional components of the throne. This grand conspiracy would eventually be uncovered by Inquisitor Erasmus Crowell of the Order Hereticus and his interrogator Lucy Spinoza following a confrontation with a Drukhari homunculus that had been smuggled onto Terra by Rasilo's allies. Eventually, sometime after the formation of the warp space rift known as the Cicatrix Maledictum, Crowell would learn that the Fabricator General of Mars, Ododi Araskia, and a number of his followers were using a webway gate located upon Luna, Terra's moon, in order to meet with the Drukhari. Crowell, along with a small force of custodians led by a warrior named Navradaran, as well as the rest of Crowell's own retinue, who had independently reached the same conclusion as their master, would then make their way into the webway in their pursuit of the conspirators. Crowell and his allies, despite frequent harassment at the hands of the Drukhari, would eventually catch up with and confront Raskia's party. The Fabricator General would then plead his case to Crowell and the others, stating that without the aid of the Drukhari, the Golden Throne was likely to fail completely and beyond recovery within the next 100 or so years. Navradaran and the other custodes would then agree to aid Raskia in his dealings with the Xenos, due to their oath to defend both the Emperor and the Golden Throne, no matter the cost. But unbeknownst to the Fabricator General, neither Crowell nor Spinoza had any intention of allowing such a heretical deal to take place, as they sensed that the aliens had ulterior motives for their actions. Upon arriving at the rendezvous point and meeting with a force of Drukhari led by Shay Morvain, Archon of the Cabal of the Still Living Knife, Imperial forces were informed that they were to be gifted with new, fully operational parts for the Golden Throne, and all that the Xenos wanted in return were the broken and damaged pieces that they would be replacing. As the negotiations continued, Crowell would sneak away in order to find evidence of their mysterious benefactors' true intentions. It was upon discovering a mysterious, mirror-like artifact which allowed him to survey all of Comorragh, the very realm of the Drukhari, that Crowell would learn that the Xenos were in the midst of constructing their own twisted equivalent to the Golden Throne. The Drukari intended on using this so-called Black Throne in order to put an end to the repeated demonic incursions that had begun erupting throughout Comorragh following the creation of the Great Rift. However, such a device would require a Psyker of incredible potency to operate it, and while their Craftworlder cousins are indeed capable of harnessing the energies of the warp in order to manifest a variety of supernatural abilities, the Drukari by contrast have, over time, become all but incapable of doing so themselves. Crowell then realised that, to his horror, the Drukari intended to harvest residual genetic material from the broken mechanisms of the Golden Throne in order to create a clone of the Emperor himself. Crow would then expose Drukari's plan during the final stages of the negotiations, prompting the custodes to immediately open fire upon the throne's damaged components, destroying them utterly and, in doing so, preventing the aliens from acquiring the Emperor's DNA. Enraged, the Drukari would attack. The custodes, along with Raskius Gitari and a platoon of inquisitorial stormtroopers, would put up a fierce resistance against the seemingly unending horde of Xenos, but Navradaran, knowing that they would eventually be overwhelmed, would order for Spinoza and another inquisitor named Latan Zyges to take the now injured Crowl and flee in order to report their findings to Terra. Crow would ultimately sacrifice himself by activating a device known as a Dark Gate, which tore both him and a pursuing Drukhari homunculus apart at a molecular level in order to give both Zyges and Spinoza a chance to escape. Despite Crow's best efforts, his sacrifice would prove to be in vain, as only the Inquisitor's eccentric servo skull, Gorgeous, would emerge from the webway unscathed, materializing upon an unknown and primitive backwater world. The final fate of Spinoza and Zyges remains unknown, though it is heavily implied that the two were either killed or captured, with the latter being a fate that is arguably worse than death. But since Spinoza was herself only mere meters away from the exit before being supposedly captured, this leads to an intriguing question. What could have happened if, instead of being captured, Spinoza had managed to escape from the webway and informed the Imperium of the Drukari's Black Throne project? Assuming that Spinoza was able to not only emerge from the webway unscathed, but make it back to Terra without incident in order to relay her findings, then such information, if brought to the attention of the High Lords, would no doubt cause ripples of panic throughout the Imperial government. Indeed, given that some of the High Lords were themselves involved in the original conspiracy, then this could very well lead to accusations of treason and heresy being leveled against each of the High Lords, regardless as to whether they were truly involved or not. This petty bickering could even lead to violence, possibly resulting in various military forces loyal to differing High Lords clashing in open combat. However, following the return of the Ultramarines Primarch Rabute Gilliman, an event which occurred shortly after the disappearance of Spinoza and Zyges, the High Lords of Terra would undergo a complete and total reorganization, with several members being outright replaced by the new Imperial Regent, which may in turn render such a possibility moot. But with the Drukari's plot to make a clone of the Emperor being brought to their attention, it's likely that at least some of the High Lords, particularly the more religious of their number, such as those representing the Ecclesiarchy and the Adeptus Sororitas, would seek to launch a holy crusade against the Xenos in response to such wanton blasphemy. However, because the Drukhari are notoriously difficult to bring onto the battlefield, with the Xenos preferring to launch lightning-fast raids against lightly defended civilian settlements, it's entirely feasible to assume that the Imperium, should it decide to instigate a crusade against the Drukhari, would attempt to launch an assault against the realm of Comorragh itself. While such a notion may seem at best foolhardy and at worst ridiculous, there is indeed a precedent for such an act. In early M35, as detailed within the 5th edition Dark Eldar Codex, Drukari raiders would successfully cripple and capture an Astartes warship of the Salamanders chapter, known as the Forge Hammer, within a region of space known as the Desiderian Gulf. As Drukari returned to Comorragh with their prize in tow, the Forge Hammer's librarian, a warrior named Hestian, would use his powers to psychically transmit a distress beacon to the rest of his chapter. Despite the Drukari's best efforts to take the Astartes aboard the Forge Hammer prisoner, the Salamanders would mount a fierce resistance, fighting non-stop for over 2 weeks straight. But before the Drukari could tighten the proverbial noose around their prey, a massive Astartes strike force which included not just warriors from the Salamanders, but also members of the Howling Griffin and Silver Skull chapters would, much to the surprise of the Drukari, breach the skies of Comorragh and launch a devastating counter-offensive against the Xenos. The resulting battle was a long and bloody affair, with the Space Marines ultimately succeeding in rescuing the Forge Hammer and subsequently fleeing back into real space. In the aftermath of the carnage, it was revealed that this entire sequence of events had been carefully orchestrated by a low-born Archon named Asdrubal Vect, in order to both bring about the downfall of Comorragh's ruling aristocracy and allow Vect to begin his now uncontested rise to power, resulting in the former slave becoming the supreme overlord of Comorragh, and by extension, the entire Drukari race. With this in mind, it's not entirely unreasonable to assume that the Imperium would, at the very least, consider the possibility of launching a raid into Comorragh in order to destroy the Drukari's dark parody of the Golden Throne. If the Imperium were to attempt an invasion of Comorragh, it's likely that the High Lords would utilize Luna as the staging point from which to amass their forces, so as to take advantage of the webway gate located upon its surface. However, whether or not this particular gate will be able to accommodate heavy armor, such as tanks and mobile artillery, is another matter entirely. While some portions of the webway network are capable of allowing objects as large as a battlecruiser to travel through them unimpeded, others are barely large enough to accommodate even a single individual. As such, should such a raid on Comorragh be given the go-ahead, then Imperial forces may need to locate a webway gate that's large enough to accommodate such a force, should the one upon Luna prove insufficient. If Imperial forces were able to catch the Drukari unaware of their invasion, similar to how the Salamanders managed to do so many centuries prior, then it's entirely possible that they could cause unprecedented amounts of destruction throughout Comorragh and destroy the Black Throne before retreating with minimal losses. However, should the assault drag on longer than expected, then it's likely that the Drukari will be able to mount a counterattack that could decimate if not outright destroy the Imperial raiding party, should the invaders be unable to achieve their objective in time. But as to how quickly the Drukari will be able to muster their forces for any sort of organised counteroffensive, none can truly say, if only for the fact that, as mentioned earlier, following the creation of the Secretrix Maledictum, the realm of Comorragh would fall victim to repeated demonic incursions. Because of this, any sort of invasion could potentially devolve into a three-way conflict between Imperial, Drukari, and demonic forces. Depending upon how much collateral damage will be caused in the wake of the Imperial assault, it's also possible that at least one of Asdrubal Vect's rivals, such as his former consort Lady Malice, would attempt to use this opportunity to assassinate or otherwise wrest power from Comorragh's supreme overlord, and in doing so mirror the very events that allowed for Vect's rise to power in the first place, though whether or not such attempts would prove successful is an altogether different matter. Alternatively, instead of launching a full-scale assault into Comorragh, the High Lords of Terra might task a smaller force with infiltrating the Dark City in order to locate and sabotage the Black Throne. Such an idea wouldn't be entirely unfeasible, as there have been a few recorded instances in where a mere handful of Imperial troops have managed to make their way in and out of Comorragh for one reason or another. A particularly prominent example of this is shown within the novel Silent Hunters, in where a small strike force of Astartes from the Kakaradons chapter would make their way into Comorragh in order to recover an artifact known as the Void Glass, which had been misappropriated by the Drukari. While most of the Kakaradons would perish during the course of their quest, some of their number, including the chaplain Tangata Manu and chief librarian Tika Harangi, would manage to retrieve the Void Glass and successfully escape from the Drukari realm. With this in mind, it may simply be more practical to dispatch a small team to infiltrate Comorragh in order to destroy the Black Throne, instead of launching a full-scale invasion. After all, a smaller team not only has better odds of making their way into Comorragh undetected, and thus attract less attention, but their actions could potentially make the destruction of the Black Throne look more like an accident as opposed to sabotage. In this case, a logical idea would be for the Officio Audiorum to dispatch an execution force to undertake such a mission, with at least one or possibly multiple Kalidas assassins being used due to their use of a drug known as polymorphine, which grants them the ability to mimic the forms of other humanoid species, such as the aforementioned Drukari. Or perhaps the Imperium would choose to make use of both methods, with a full-scale invasion serving to distract the Xenos, while a specialist team makes their way to the Black Throne in order to destroy it, whilst encountering as little resistance as possible. In either case, the destruction of the Black Throne project, which as mentioned earlier was being undertaken to help protect Comorragh against the recent outbreak of demonic incursions, would undoubtedly spur the Drukhari into retaliating. However, the full extent of the Drukhari's retaliation may depend on how exactly the Black Throne was destroyed. If the Black Throne was stealthily sabotaged by a small cadre of infiltrators, then the blame for such an act could potentially fall on the rival Cabal or Cabals to those tasked with undertaking the construction of the Black Throne. After all, the politics of Drukhari society are, to grossly oversimplify, notoriously cutthroat, filled with double dealings and sometimes literal acts of backstabbing. As such, it would be perfectly reasonable to assume that the destruction of the Black Throne could be seen as a rival Cabal's attempt to undermine and embarrass those behind the Black Throne project. Alternatively, any critical fault within the Black Throne could in itself be seen as nothing more than an unfortunate malfunction, as opposed to an act of sabotage, which, if this were the case, would provoke no retaliation against the Imperium whatsoever. But if the destruction of the Black Throne was blatantly due to Imperial interference, then the Drukhari could potentially respond in a number of ways. The first possibility is that the Drukhari simply increase the amount of slave raids that they launch against Imperial settlements, taking more and more civilians prisoner simply out of spite. Or perhaps the Drukhari would instead choose to launch a retaliatory attack against Terra itself via the Webway network. While such an idea may initially seem incredibly unlikely due to Terra being one of the most heavily defended worlds within the entire galaxy, such an idea is not entirely without precedent. During the War of the Beast, as detailed within the novel Throne World, a handful of Eldari from the mysterious Harlequin sect, led by the Shadow Seer Lariel Ray, would use the Webway in order to make their way into the very heart of the Imperial Palace, intent on delivering a message to none other than the Emperor himself. While the other Harlequins would ultimately fall to the blades of the Custodes, Lariel Ray would herself be spared from execution, thanks to the combined efforts of Draken Vangerich, the Imperial Grandmaster of Assassins, and the Inquisitor Lastan Veritas, who instead sought to interrogate the Shadow Seer. It's also important to note that while just a small number of Harlequins managed to infiltrate the Imperial Palace, their actions managed to catch the Custodes completely unaware, resulting in several Custodians being slain by the Xenos in their attempt to reach the Sanctum Imperialis, the chamber where the Emperor himself resides. With this in mind, if the Drukhari were able to launch a full-scale invasion of the Imperial Palace, then the Xenos would be able to inflict catastrophic amounts of destruction and devastation due to their use of the Webway, granting them the crucial element of surprise. If a mere handful of Harlequins were capable of making their way to the Eternity Gate, then it's not unreasonable to assume that a full army of Drukhari would be able to do so as well. Should the Drukhari ever use the Webway to launch a full-scale invasion of the Imperial Palace, then not only could such a force be capable of inflicting catastrophic damage, but depending upon the size of the force and how fast such a blitzkrieg assault can be undertaken, there is even a chance, even if only an incredibly small one, that during the ensuing confusion, the Drukhari could succeed in breaching the Eternity Gate and make their way into the very heart of the Sanctum Imperialis. If such a scenario were to ever occur, then assuming that the Drukhari could not only fight their way past the Companions, those Custodians tasked with guarding the Emperor within the very confines of the throne room, but also withstand the sheer burning aura of power radiating from his body, then theoretically, the Drukhari could achieve their goal of acquiring a sample of the Emperor's DNA before withdrawing back into the Webway. Should the Drukhari then manage to retreat back into the Webway with their prize unscathed, then the Xenos would finally have the means to create a being powerful enough to operate the Black Throne, and in turn finally put an end to the demonic incursions repeatedly plaguing their realm. But as it currently stands, the Imperium continues to remain blissfully unaware of just how close the Drukhari came to creating a twisted, malformed clone of the God Emperor himself. What do you think? Leave a comment below, and thanks for watching!